we want to change now the topic of the conversation. I want to ask you which problems do you see in Skinner's behaviorisms, which are the principal criticals can be done, and the most important points that it introduced for you?
That's a very tall order. I mean, I'm supposed to do that in how much time? 5 minutes?
But don't worry, the time you want.
Let me say this about it. When I was a student, nobody cared about the difference between applications and the basic science. There was one journal, mainly in the early days in the 1950s. People published in the American Psychological Association journals. There wasn't as much publication across international lines as there is today. And now there's so many different journals, including some that are that I see the tables of contents of, and I can't say the names that in Spain, but in those days there was the one journal. Now eventually the field grew, and for practical reasons it became useful to separate out people who were doing what they call basic experimental analysis behavior and people who are doing applications. And they began to have different boards of editors. And once you have that difference, then you get different communities who don't talk as much to each other. And nowadays people worry about that, and they talk about doing work that will transfer from the basic to the applied. But in those early days, nobody cared about the difference. After all, Skinner not only did his basic work, but he worked on teaching machines. He worked in psychopharmacology, which is certainly an applied area. People began working on drug self-administering monkeys and showing how the things we understood had applications to those areas. Murray Sidman started doing his work with rats, but later on was working with kids. He did the equivalence class stuff by working with a kid who had developmental issues. Charlie Furster was doing pigeon lab stuff and work with other animals, but then he started working with these children on the autism spectrum, then called psychotic in those days. I had already mentioned Og Lindsley, who also did basic work and then started working on psychiatric wards. Nate Azrin was doing work on punishment with pigeons, but then he went on to do token economies with Teodoro Ione. Ted Ione actually did a lot of the starting work on token economies. And in fact, as Nate has sometimes said, that it was really Ted who got those kinds of things started. So in those days, nobody drew distinctions between the applied and the basic. It was all one thing. And if you look at the history of a science, you could say, well, there's this line that goes to the basic research and there's this other line that goes to the applied research. But applications grow out of a successful science. If the science is successful, then what you should see as time goes on is the applications grow and grow and grow. And that's in fact what happened through the 20th century. Even the ancestors of behavior analysis, like Edward Lee Thorndike, who did work on puzzle boxes initially and who did the animal intelligence stuff. Well, he went on to Teachers College and got into educational applications. John B. Watson, of course, he ended up doing his work in advertising. That created some problems actually in the culture, but it came out of his initial basic work. So I find it hard to try to categorize things. Yeah, the things that may come out and be important 10 years from now may be just a little bit here and there, and we can't be sure yet where they will go. But I see that there's instead of worrying about what the main themes are, I see that there's a unification in the science. It's all built on this notion that selection is at the heart of what we study. selection of the consequences of behavior within the lifetime of the individual organism. And once you extend that to verbal behavior gets selected. It gets selected early on in a complex evolution of the child's vocalizations, which create the phonemes in the language the child ends up speaking. That's selection and is a subcategory of the kinds of selection that work at other levels. And once you've got that selection and you can shape verbal behavior, then verbal behavior can determine what people do. And we need to understand more of how that works, how our nonverbal behavior is related to the verbal stuff. It's also really, really important that we teach that outside of our limited numbers and get it out there into our cultures so that more people understand that and can appreciate the dangers as well as the advantages that come from that. So I'm not sure that I've answered your question, but I've tried to at least address the implications for the future. I think we're moving to a time when more and more people do recognize behavior analysis because of its effective applications as something that's worth paying attention to, and it's being more accepted. And we have a more unified kind of message, I think, in that we have these basics to teach than some other approaches.
Okay.
Well, we wanted to ask you something related with that, about the future of psychology, the future of behaviorism. How do you see that?
Well, it all depends on the future of our world. We've got some problems with the planet and global warming and political problems and international tensions. We are a tiny piece of that, and we have to protect what we have. So the future will depend on whether we can turn out students who follow up the work. It's the next generation is going to be more important than us in keeping this work going. I am still optimistic, but I worry. But I don't think we can predict the specifics. We don't know where the next breakthroughs will come. I suspect that there's the tendency to say, well, once we know more about the nervous system, but the nervous system, it serves behavior. In fact, the nervous system kind of adopts itself to the body it finds itself in. So there are people who think, well, okay, if we knew something about how the brain worked, we'd be able to understand verbal behavior. Well, no, it goes the other way around. The environment drives the organization of the nervous system. And maybe that is one of the directions that's important for the future. Those people who are interested in neuroscience and who are interested in behavior might spend their time trying to see how environments can cause the organization of the nervous system. Visual cortex will develop in different ways in somebody who's born with eyes that develop in the ordinary way, but a child who's born without vision, that part of the cortex will end up being devoted to other kinds of things, and the auditory cortex will become more finely differentiated. But it's the environments that are accessible because of what's available at the periphery will determine that development. So I would say if you're the kind of person who would like to go into neurosciences, start with the environment and work in, because if you don't have an understanding of how behavior is selected at the behavioral level, you won't know what to look for in the brain. Skinner put that a long time ago, and he said behavior gives the assignments to the neuroscientists. It tells them what the properties must be of the systems that do it. then they have to figure out how those systems work. But if they're trying to look for a system that works by associations or Pavlovian stuff, and they're trying to figure how our operant behavior works based on those kinds of assumptions, they're not going to get anywhere because they won't be asking the right questions. Asking the right questions really matters a lot.
Yes. You talk about next generation. We wanted to know some names of psychologists that are going to be the future, that are doing now some good.
Look, I'm an old guy. I can't keep up with all the new names. And I think it's often counterproductive to kind of say, oh, this person's going to be the star tomorrow and this one's just going to do it doesn't work that way. It's often surprising. When I was just getting started, I didn't know where I'd end up. And it's nice now that and if you looked at some of the things I did back then and said, oh, he did those things and they're going to be neat. Well, it turns out that hardly anybody pays any attention to some of that anymore. What I'm really struck by is how a few of my early papers now are being cited a lot, although they weren't a long time ago. It's only in the past few years that I'm seeing citations of my work with Elliot Shimoff and Bud Matthews, in which we did experiments on verbal shaping. There was some follow-throughs and things like that, but it's only in the past, say, 10 years that we've seen a lot of people citing those papers, which is great because it means that people are doing work on those kinds of problems. And so if you want to do those kinds of things, look at citations, and you suddenly find that a lot of people are in different places are taking interest in this work, and then look at those papers, and because they will target the issues which now more and more people are taking an interest in. But then there are neglected areas too, because of concerns about animal welfare, because of concerns about ethics of doing research, both with humans and with animals. We have a much more cumbersome system for people getting through their institutional reviews and getting cleared to be able to do certain kinds of research. And there's some kind of research that is actually it could be problematic, but we don't know anywhere near as much as maybe we should know about aversive procedures. The world is filled with punishers, and people use it on each other. That's what's going on in the Ukraine, and there's all kinds of awful stuff going on. We don't know much about it though, because it became more and more difficult to do those kinds of experiments, and unfortunately, people worked with aversive stimuli that had large effects and that were questionable, like electric shock. But there are much more modest kinds of aversive stimuli, like noise, a brief noise, in which it would be possible to study a whole lot of things and look at the basics of punishment, the way we've looked and look at parametric things without a kind of a stimulus that's really totally objectionable. And if we're ever going to want to address these big kinds of issues that exist at the human level, then we really ought to understand a few more of the basics. What are the kinds of parameters that matter? And so I could say, I'd like to see this happening, but I can't point to people who will be doing it because it's not the kind of thing that people go into as a field. It's harder to get funding for it. It's harder to get it off the ground. Well, and just one example of a practical thing it would be nice to know. We know that organisms look at stimuli correlated with reinforcers. They're less likely to look at stimuli correlated with aversive events. But sometimes they do. We do take the call from the doctor, or we do call the doctor to get a diagnosis. And getting that diagnosis might be really an aversive event. If we can learn that something bad's going to happen. It may be that and I'm talking about observing responses, looking at things. It would be nice to know in, say, an animal model, a non-human model, if organisms are more likely to look at stimuli correlated with aversive events, if they are aversive events they can do something about, than they are to look at stimuli correlated with aversive events in the presence in which they are powerless.
Mhm.
That could then tell us something about, and by the way, a lot of the stuff in fake news, people go to the news they want to hear. They read the things that they're already familiar with. A lot of things that have happened in now in the media and in all of the internet stuff with social networks and things involve people differentially going to look at some things and not others. Well, we ought to be able, if we knew more about the kinds of reinforcers that maintain that behavior and that lead to isolated systems in which people only talk to this very small community, it'd be worth knowing more about that. And these kinds of basic experiments are relevant to those kinds of situations.